There was indeed a time, back in the late 1960s, that two vice lords had an idea of how to protect a certain area in neighborhood of West Garfield Park from people outside that threatened the neighborhood with drug dealing, gang banging, and violence. The idea of the Four Corner Hustlers was about one main thing: neighborhood protection. And that did not mean only protection for their members, but for everyone that lived in this territory. The territory was Madison Street on the north to Jackson Boulevard on the south, and from Independence on the east to Pulaski Road on the west, and all the street corners in between, including Jackson and Springfield, Springfield and Adams, Springfield and Wilcox, Springfield and Monroe, Springfield and Madison, Madison and Hamlin, Monroe and Hamlin, Hamlin and Wilcox, Adams and Hamlin, Jackson and Hamlin, Pulaski and Monroe, Pulaski and Wilcox, and Pulaski and Adams. That is quite a bit of territory for a brand new gang. But 17-year-old Walter Wheat, who had just left the unknown vice lords, and another vice lord, 15-year-old Marvin Evans, made it happen. They organized it with another unknown vice lord, 15-year-old Freddie Gage, Richard Left Hand Goodman, and Monroe Money Banks, and approximately 7 others. Freddie Gage would become second in command over this new organization. Within no time, the Four Corner Hustlers flipped the West Garfield Park unknown vice lords, which pretty much closed the chapter on unknown vice lord influence in West Garfield Park. They formed a gang for fighting, not a drug-dealing gang or a gang that destroyed their own neighborhood. Instead, they were going to beat down any gang that came in there acting destructive. This idea was all put together at Delano Playground at the corner of Springfield and Wilcox. The Four Corner Hustlers had strict rules to abide by. No drug dealing, no drug using, not even marijuana, no mugging, no burglarizing, but shoplifting and stealing from delivery trucks was fully acceptable. Any violence inflicted on rival gangs was acceptable too. Shooting, stabbing, cracking skulls, whatever needed to be done to show who was running those corners was acceptable. One gang that was on a heavy recruiting drive by 1968 was the Supreme Gangsters, a Southside gang, that started their West Side campaign in September of 1967 at Gladys and Keeler, which was just a block or two away from the original Four Corner Hustlers. The Supreme Gangster were known drug dealers and recruited aggressively on the West Side. The Supreme Gangster mainly conflicted with the Jive Fives and the Black Pimps, and both those gangs were enemies of the original Fours too. The Supreme Gangster absorbed the Pimps and Jives within no time, and this made them more powerful. And this was the beginning of a long and permanent legacy of the gangster disciples in the West Garfield Park community. This original settlement of the Supreme Gangsters, gangster disciples, was part of what drove the Four Corner Hustlers to be founded to oppose this group. The Black Souls gang had spread to West Garfield Park, just west of Pulaski, but north of the Supreme Gangsters, as they were neighbors of the Four Corner Hustlers as well. The Souls were allies for the Fours. On February 14, 1972, Four Corner Hustlers and unknown Vice Lord gang members attended a Valentine's Day dance at 3906 Lexington Ave, corner of Springfield and Lexington, at the Presentation Catholic Church. The dance was an invite-only situation, and Officer Henderson Arnold told everyone they must have a membership card to stay at the dance in the basement. 18-year-old Freddie Gage was one that did not have an invitation, and Officer Arnold told him to leave. When he refused, a struggle happened between the officer and Gage that resulted in the gun firing off, which caused a bullet to hit Officer Arnold in his face and neck. Afterward, Four Corner Hustler Leo Walker came up with his pistol and started blasting at Officer Arnold as well, while Freddie Gage and Walter Wheat tackled him according to court documents. As Officer Arnold tried to escape, he was being shot at. Arnold survived and needed surgery to repair the damage. He was shot 3 times. It was at this point in time that Frederick King Freddy Gage now was sentenced to do 10 years in prison for this attempted murder. And it was at this point in time that the Four Corner Hustlers were first documented. However, they were not widely known. In the year 1975, Walter Wheat was sent to prison for aggravated assault and other charges. He was to spend over 10 years in prison. At this point, without King Wheat or King Freddy, the Four Corner Hustlers began to be slowly seduced by the lull of the heroin trade that was forbidden by Walter Wheat and Freddy Gage. Around this time, the Black Souls were getting larger in number in West Garfield Park and wanted to expand their drug trade. The new Black Soul leader was Wayne Jack Bobo Edwards, and he was looking for a new opportunity at Monroe and Pulaski. This corner was original Four Corner Hustler territory, but Jack Bobo was looking to make some profits. He offered to operate here respectfully, as they would team up against the Vice Lords or any supreme gangsters that came into the area. This was the creation of the 404+ concept that united Four Corner Hustlers and Black Souls. This was a small start for Four Corner Hustlers to be involved in the drug trade, although it was impossible for them to operate at a high level because it would fall under the radar of the imprisoned leadership. With drug profits came expansion as Four Corner Hustlers now moved into the Austin neighborhood. During the court case of People v. Allen, police officer John Nee testified during the 1993 court proceedings against the Four Corner Hustlers that he had been watching their drug operations around Madison and Menard for 18 years. Fact source, People v. Allen. If you do the math, 18 years from 1993 is 1975, which is the same year Walt Wheat went to prison, and the same year the Four Corner Hustlers began linking to drug trafficking operations. At the time, Austin was converting into a majority black community and was experiencing racial strife. Different Vice Lord gangs dominated Austin by then, but were mostly welcoming to the Four Corner Hustlers to come settle these streets. Four Corner Hustlers became a hit with black youths of Austin, and the Fours grew to very large numbers quickly. The Four Corner Hustlers would become larger in the Austin community than their original West Garfield Park territory. Just like Vice Lord groups, the Four Corner Hustlers saw opportunity with the heroin trade in Austin, as it was a neighborhood connected to the Eisenhower Expressway, making for easy drug trafficking. Because of this, Four Corner Hustlers settled heavily in South Austin, near Columbus Park. Four Corner Hustler settlement didn't stop in South Austin. Eventually, Fours would dominate much of Central Austin, and even have a good chunk of territory in Northern Austin, along North Ave. Four Corner Hustlers have made Austin their permanent home, with an influence that has been passed down through the generations. In April 1978, the People Alliance was formed, and the Vice Lords were one of the main organizations to put it together, and in charge of what organizations get in. The Vice Lords would only allow Four Corner Hustlers into the People Alliance if they joined the Vice Lord Nation as a branch. This decision was difficult for leadership to make, but in order to gain People Alliance protection, the Four Corners Hustlers in prison joined the Vice Lords, as they were now kind of Four Corner Hustler Vice Lords. But on the streets, this did not mean that Fours were going around claiming Vice Lord. It only meant a change in colors from black and brown to black and gold, and peace with Vice Lords. Four Corner Hustlers on the streets remained an independent group. In the year 1979, the El Ruckens organization on the south side of Chicago handed down sanctions upon the Black P Stones, demanding they cease to existence or succumb to violence. This is when Black P Stones called upon allies from the west side. Conservative Vice Lords, traveling Vice Lords and insane Vice Lords were called upon from the Vice Lords, as was Four Corner Hustlers. Some of the hardest and craziest of the four-corner hustlers were called upon the flip black pea stones to four-corner hustlers, or many other stones went with vice lord groups. Four-corner hustlers were invited to settle and flip stones in South Chicago, South Shore, Roseland, Chatham, and in the Altgeld Gardens projects in the Riverdale community. This is how four-corner hustlers came to the South Side and became major permanent fixtures in these communities. Four-corner hustlers were also invited to the LeClaire Courts projects in the Garfield Ridge community, but here I do not believe they flipped stones, because stones arrived for the first time the same year. The fours were a big part of the LeClaire Courts until the projects were razed by 2011. In late October of 1983, Freddie Gage was scheduled to be released from prison after his 10-year stint for attempted murder of a Chicago police officer on the Valentine's Day shooting in 1972. On the day before his release, he celebrated by drinking some bad moonshine that ended up killing him. He died at 29 years old. On November 1st, 1983, a massive funeral service was put together for Gage, which brought 5,000 people to his funeral. The funeral consisted of many members of the Vice Lords and Four-Corner Hustlers, and several others. There was a massive line down Chicago Ave that caused one lane of traffic to be blocked. This story made the first page in the Chicago Tribune, but the funny thing is, they called him a conservative Vice Lord leader, and did not even mention the Four-Corner Hustlers. This shows that the Fours were not quite known yet in Chicago, but that would soon change. You're watching the Everything Network. In 1985, Marvin Shorty Evans retired from the gang life and found religion, leaving just Walter Wheat and Monroe Money Banks as original leaders of the organization, but both were in prison. In 1986, Monroe Banks was released from prison after doing time since 1975. Walter Wheat was released the same year. In the year 1986, Banks was released early out on parole. As soon as Banks hit the streets, he found the Four-Corner Hustlers were selling drugs in small quantities and loving the money that came with it. Banks would show them a higher level of dealing that would make the Fours richer than ever, with now the distribution of crack cocaine was the new business. He set up a complex drug operation and expanded Four-Corner Hustler territory into the northern part of the Austin neighborhood, which was the beginning of the true growth of the Four-Corner Hustlers. Right away, drug profits began stacking up, and Monroe Banks was living up to his nickname, Money. He also created the black diamond symbol to represent the newfound profits and the new order. This was a hell of a come-up for the 4S, and this led to more violent behavior as killing over profits became more common. When Walter Wheat and Monroe Banks were released at the same time, Walter Wheat left Banks because he now realized profit was a big thing for the Fours now, and it was best to leave it to Banks. This did not stop Wheat from expressing his displeasure of this new crack involvement and any drug trafficking. Wheat would still have influence over the organization that some groups of Fours considered an infringement in their profits. During the later 1980s, as the Four-Corner Hustlers got deeper embedded in the drug trade, it led to more violent crime convictions. The future leader of the Four-Corner Hustlers, Angelo Roberts, was one member that got caught up in a murder case, alongside Four-Corner Hustler co-founder Eugene Royney. According to the court case of the People vs. Royney, January 24, 1988, Chicago police found the dead body of Stephen Edwards found behind a Jewel grocery store located at 3552 West Grand Avenue in the West Humboldt Park neighborhood. The man was beaten to death and tied up with torn strips of bed sheets around his face, neck, hands, knees, and thighs. He had cuts dug into his chest that caused lots of bleeding. It appeared Edwards had been kidnapped and tortured. The detectives then visited Edward's address at 3841 West Adams in the West Garfield Park neighborhood, which is right in the middle of the original Four Corner Hustler territory. Edwards was living in the basement of this building and was a drug addict. The landlord was interviewed and gave permission for the police to enter the building and search the basement. They also spoke to Royney. The police found evidence the murder happened in the basement, as the torn rags found on Edwards matched the bedspread that Edwards slept on in the basement. Royney told police that Edwards had been accused by his girlfriend Carolyn Lewis of stealing from her, and she wanted him to leave her alone. That's when she went to Royney to help keep Edwards away. In another incident sometime later in the month, Edwards and another man were cooking cocaine and heroin in the basement when they broke out into an argument about how much drugs each of them would get. Royney and Angelo Roberts said they came downstairs to break up the fight. Royney and Roberts allegedly saw Edwards hit his partner with a stool, so Royney hit Edwards with a lead pipe in the back of the legs and twice in the head, making it into a protection type of murder. Royney originally stated that Edwards left with two men in a car after the argument, but later admitted he killed him, but made it look accidental or justified. Forensic experts testified they found extensive evidence of repeated blows all over his body and found stab wounds in each lung. They also found evidence the man was tied up as he was beaten and stabbed. Royney had said there was a party in the building, and he happened to hear the commotion downstairs and came to discipline Edwards. However, it was later confirmed there was no party that day. It then became conclusive that the murder was planned, and Royney was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. His violent past perhaps did not help his case, because he was once convicted of murder in 1969 as well. Angelo Roberts wouldn't cooperate when interviewed by police, and he used his Fifth Amendment rights to not testify against Royney, proving that Angelo Roberts was no snitch and was loyal to the organization. Roberts also avoided charges of trying to conceal a homicide and unlawful use of a weapon. He was later suspected of shooting a police officer in 1990, but managed to dodge conviction. The way he handled this case enhanced his reputation greatly. Eugene Royney is presently still in prison, serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole. These younger fours were a new breed of killer types that followed every teaching of Monroe Banks, and they modeled after him. Banks was known to be ruthless and very serious about not letting competition get in his way. This led to increased gang wars into the very early 1990s. This also led to the death of Monroe Banks in August of 1991. According to the History Channel's show Gangland, he was shot while watching a man try to get a cat down from a tree. Then a member of the Black Souls shot him dead. This murder would of course further intensify the wars with Black Soul factions. After Monroe, Money El Ghani, Banks was killed. The throne was wide open, and Walter Wheat was not going to step back. Instead, he appointed his soon-to-be son-in-law Angelo Lowe Roberts to be the new leader of the organization. Lowe was only 21 years old, but wanted to expand the Four Corner Hustlers into a super gang. Wheat was hoping the father of his grandchild would bring the Fours to a more controllable level and smooth out operations. Roberts instead brought even more expansion than ever, and this even brought a new section to the white and increasingly Hispanic neighborhood of Belmont Cragin in the year 1991. Two Puerto Rican youths from Lockwood and Altgeld had joined the Four Corner Hustlers and asked Angelo to bless them with their own chapter in the neighborhood. Angelo granted Musi and his cousin the request, and Lockwood and Altgeld Fours would now become Spanish Four Corner Hustlers. Muis would run these Spanish Fours until he was put in Statesville prison. The Spanish Four Corner Hustlers immediately made new enemies that were not just folks, but also went at it with the Taylor Jousters and the Latin Pachucos. The Belmont Cragin chapter that was established in 1991 caused recruitment of the Latin kings into Belmont Cragin to become hampered as Hispanic youths became heavily influenced by the Spanish Four Corner Hustlers. Spanish Fours arrived in other Hispanic and white neighborhoods like Hermosa and Portage Park. Belmont Cragin and Hermosa became permanent settlements of the Spanish Four Corner Hustlers. Four Corner Hustlers also settled in some other mostly white communities. But these fours settled among the black population in the West Ridge and Uptown neighborhoods in 1991. In these communities, the Four Corner Hustlers established smaller but permanent settlements. Under Roberts, the Four Corner Hustlers moved into the West Humboldt Park community. Four Corner Hustlers gained instant popularity and grew well into the community, establishing permanent presence since 1991. Many West Humboldt Park black and Hispanic youths loved the ways preached to them about the Fours, making the Fours become one of the larger gangs in West Humboldt Park. Under Roberts' leadership, Four Corner Hustler popularity spread heavily to black youths living in the projects on the west side. Promises and large profits and shown more respect. Many black youths in the projects now would join the Four Corner Hustlers, while Angelo Roberts was able to flip groups of other gangs, primarily Gangster Stones and Vice Lord groups, to convert to Four Corner Hustlers and establish a complex crack cocaine operation in the Henry Horner projects, Rockwell Gardens projects, and Maplewood Courts projects, all in the near West Side neighborhood in 1991. The Four Corner Hustlers became one of the more powerful gangs in these buildings. When the city planned to tear down the projects, the Four Corner Hustlers made future plans to establish themselves on the streets of the near West Side after the buildings were razed in the 2000s decade. And this is how Four Corner Hustlers are a permanent part of the near West Side community, even if the neighborhood has become much more expensive in recent decades. Angelo Roberts also made the organization no longer a gang for just blacks. Now all races could join up north and in the suburbs. This would of course grow the Four Corner Hustler army to numbering over 1,000 members in no time. Angelo also grew the organization in many other states, like Atlanta, Georgia, for example, that still pays homage to him. Roberts set up a complex drug operation in the Rockwell Gardens housing projects and the Henry Horner homes, and was moving thousands, if not millions of dollars worth of crack and heroin within these buildings. The Chicago police clamped down on him and did a major raid on his operation, which got Roberts in jail. When Roberts got out of prison in June of 1994, he would encounter legal issues right away. It became rumored after his release that he wanted to blow up the Chicago Police District 11 police station. It was also said that on July 25, 1994, Angelo Roberts plotted the death of Walter Wheat. On this Monday, July 25, 1994, 43-year-old Walter Wheat was sitting in a car waiting for his friends to come back out, as they were in a clothing store at the 3800 block of West Chicago Ave. As he sat there, a shirtless 17-year-old Bobby Cooley rode up on the car with a 9mm pistol and fired 2 shots into Wheat's back and the back of his head. The founder and leader and longtime advisor behind the new leaders of the Four Corner Hustlers was now killed by his own gang. By September, Cooley was apprehended and charged with another shooting as well. He is currently doing a life sentence for killing King Walter Wheat.
You're watching the Everything Network.
Roberts attempted to buy all the high-powered weapons in what he thought was a deal with drug dealers, as he attempted to buy a Laws anti-tank rocket in exchange for cash and drugs. It turned out he was trying to buy from ATF agents. Somehow there was no arrest at the scene, because Roberts got suspicious and went into hiding for the rest of 1994. Authorities reported that Roberts wanted to use this weapon to blow up the District 11 Police Headquarters at 3151 West Harrison Street on Chicago's West Side for revenge for interrupting his drug operations in the housing projects. On January 16, 1995, at 1 a.m., CPD found the body of Roberts at 7009 South Vernon, near 70th and Vernon, right near the Park Manor Apartments in the Greater Grand Crossing neighborhood. He was found with his throat slashed in the back of a brown Chevy. No one has ever been caught in connection for the murder. Whether or not Angelo Roberts had the intention of using the rocket on the District 11 police station is true or not. One thing for sure is, Roberts had conflict with the District 11 police. His conflict with the police may have brought on his death. Some rumors say the police kidnapped Angelo and killed him. Some rumors also say that the murder of Walter Wheat seems off, and that maybe Angelo did not kill him. After the death of Angelo Roberts, Ray Longstreet took over leadership of the Four Corner Hustlers. Eventually, the Four Corner Hustlers would grow to have over 18,000 members. Many Four Corner Hustlers still pay homage to Angelo Roberts, Monroe Banks, and Walter Wheat. The Four Corner Hustlers would eventually grow to have over 10,000 members.
If you haven't already, please take a second to subscribe to the channel, and also don't forget to click on the notification bell so you'll be up to date on all videos released from the Everything Network.
You're watching the Everything Network. African-American Southerners had been migrating to the Near West Side for decades before the 1940s. But migration picked up in the early 1940s, and blacks began migrating heavier into the Maxwell Street Market area, right by the famous Maxwell Street Market along Halsted Street. By the later 1940s, the black population of the neighborhood had grown quite significant, and many more black children wanted to frequent Stanford Park that used to be located at 14th Place and Union. Stanford Park was a highly coveted park that offered several recreational activities for neighborhood youth since 1907. There were parks, a pool, and even areas to play sporting games. This was one of the first parks in the city and was cherished by many West Siders. This was also a park loved by hoodlums and street toughs since it opened. Throughout the decades of the first half of the 20th century, different ethnic groups would fight over the park. The Italians and Irish loved to keep the Jews out of the park, and Jewish youths often had to knuckle up to fight their way in. The park was located right in between Little Italy and Maxwell Street Market area, so there was for sure rivalry there. By the 1940s, as the black population of the Near West Side grew, more and more blacks began to occupy the park, much to the dismay of Italian and Irish youths. By the late 1940s, black residents made Stanford Park a pillar of their social activities. In the minds of the Italians and the Irish, it looked like a takeover of the blacks of their beloved park. This was common all over the city in later years, where whites would feel threatened or angered seeing their parks and pools filled with blacks. And just like what happened to the Jews in previous decades, the blacks would have to fight to use the park. Different social athletic clubs would fight one another after baseball matches or basketball games until they evolved into something similar to gangs. The same could be said about the boys near Stanford Park. The black social athletic clubs would evolve into gangs as they fought the Italian or Irish athletic clubs for the park. The most notorious of the black clubs were the Clovers of 14th and Halsted, and the Imperial Chaplains of Maxwell and Halsted to Roosevelt. These two clubs fought the Irish and Italians and were allies in the late 1940s, but by the early 1950s, they began fighting each other. In the year 1950, the Loomis Courts projects were constructed, and Imperial Chaplains and Clovers moved into these buildings and took control. As the Grace Abbott public housing projects opened in the near West Side neighborhood in 1952, Chaplains and Clovers moved into these buildings. Simultaneously, Chaplains and Clovers were also moving into the Jane Addams projects, as those projects were now starting to allow blacks to move into the older section. Both gangs were taking over the Abella housing projects and were the first to run the Village. In the year 1951, members of the Imperial Chaplains and 14th Street Clovers settled in the North Lawndale neighborhood, as many Jewish residents moved out of the area. The Chaplains made 16th and Homan, down the 16th and Trumbull as their main stronghold. The rivalries between Clovers and Chaplains would now carry over onto these streets. Although their rivalry kicked off in the early 1950s, they were not a completely wild bunch. Many of times, Clovers and Chaplains had to focus on fighting off invading gangs and other hate groups coming from nearby South Lawndale that invaded the neighborhood looking for blacks. In the year 1954, a group broke away from the Chaplains in Maxwell Street Market area that took on the name Egyptian Cobras. The Cobras had their own idea of how to handle issues. By 1955, more gangs began breaking away from the Chaplains, causing a major gang war on the streets of North Lawndale and Maxwell Street Market area, which prompted many more members of this mostly Jewish community to leave the neighborhood. The Chaplains still continued to grow despite losing members to other gangs. The newer members were junior chaplains. The Egyptian Cobras also colonized North Lawndale in the Fillmore district at 14th and Kedval. Black youths faced in the neighborhood, and the Cobras seemed to have a more violent and extreme approach. In the mid-1950s, Chaplains began to spread around the West Side heavily as they settled deeply into the near West Side neighborhood. Chaplains also steamrolled into West Garfield Park and East Garfield Park, and could even be found in the Cabrini Green high-rise projects as they opened up in 1955. Clovers would also join them there. In the year 1957, the Henry Horner public housing projects opened their doors for the first time, and Imperial Chaplains made their way into these buildings, as did their rivals, the Egyptian Cobras and 14th Street Clovers. Clovers, Chaplains, and Egyptian Cobras were the first to dominate Henry Horner projects. By 1957, the Chicago police had identified and targeted the Chaplains and Clovers and began arresting several members of many gangs in the neighborhood. Many of the boys were taken to the Illinois Youth Center in St. Charles to serve out sentences. It was in this facility where Edwin Parry got together with 6 other youths to create the Vice Lords. 2 of the youths, Wren and Maurice Calloway, were members of the Imperial Chaplains, and Edwin Parry tried to join, but Big John of the Chaplains wouldn't let him. In the fall of 1958, when the Vice Lords hit the streets of North Lawndale, they aggressively attempted a complete takeover of the whole North Lawndale neighborhood. Rivals like the Imperial Chaplains stood in their way. The Imperials were still in very large numbers, in the hundreds by 1959, and the Vice Lords had a personal vendetta to settle against them. Edwin Parry was enraged that Bowchest of the Chaplains had slapped a Vice lady in the face, and now Parry wanted to chop the arm off that Bowchest slapped her with, and bring it back as a trophy, basically. One Friday night, Pep and the Vice Lords found out Bowchest and several Chaplains were gathering at the Central Park Theater, 3531 39W Roosevelt Road. The Vice Lords marched down there and started a big brawl with the Chaplains. In the midst of the fight, the Vice Lords and Parry pinned Bowchest down and slowly began cutting his arm off with a blade. They severed his arm halfway before the police intervened. When Perry went to prison for cutting Beauchest's arm nearly off, word got around the facility, and all the Imperial chaplains incarcerated flipped to vice lords. This severely declined their numbers. By 1960, the chaplains were losing numbers badly, especially after the vice lords flipped most of their incarcerated members. It appeared the gang was about to go extinct until they revitalized themselves on 16th Street in 1961 and began recruiting very well again. In 1961, the vice lords kept beating up Egyptian Cobras and Imperial chaplains any time they saw them on the streets wearing their sweaters. Vice lords stripped the sweaters, saving up a few hundred of them, until they crashed a party that Cobras and chaplains were throwing. All the vice lords were wearing the sweaters, disguising themselves as Cobras and chaplains, until all of a sudden they started beating on actual Cobras and chaplains. The vice lords shot out the ceiling lights with shotguns and threw their jukebox down the stairs. Of course, because of all the sweaters, it was hard to tell who was who, but vice lords ordered actual Cobras and chaplains to move over in one area, but no one moved. And this is when Cobras and chaplains never wore the sweaters again. Vice lords were known for crashing rival gang parties and beating everyone up in sight while kicking out their windows. This was all strategies to terrorize and intimidate other gangs in the area and cause them all to shrink in size. By the autumn of 1961, Imperial chaplains finally gave in and became vice lords. However, they wanted their own branch that they called Imperial Vice Lords. In the year 1971, the Imperial Vice Lords landed in the Austin neighborhood at Chicago Avenue and Austin Avenue. In this community, the Imperial Vice Lords met another Vice Lord branch led by Benny Lee called the Insane Vice Lords from Madison Street and Cicero Avenue, and the two branches became close. In the year 1975, the leader of the Insane Vice Lords, Benny Lee, was incarcerated, and leadership of the Imperial Vice Lords was also no longer existent. It was at this point that both IVL gangs came together to form the Imperial Insane Vice Lords. And there was a new leader of this Vice Lord group, Sidney, Don Sid, Prince Symphony Sid, Prince Shai Ku Orton, Hughes, that led the organization and personally oversaw all operations in the Grace Abbott Imperial Insane Vice Lord buildings until 1982, when he was convicted of rape charges. Afterward, Matthew D.J. Williams took over as the leader of all operations for 20 years. Under Williams' leadership, the Imperial Insane Vice Lords grew incredibly on the west side of Chicago, mainly in Austin neighborhood, and the public housing projects on the west side. Williams also opted to allow all races into the organization in 1985, when the Vice Lord Nation bestowed that option on all branches. They opened operations in the north side neighborhoods of Uptown and Albany Park in the 1980s and 1990s. The Imperial Insanes also opened on the south side at 71st and Jeffrey in the South Shore neighborhood, and they also opened in the suburbs of Elgin and Joliet. They also still operate in large numbers presently. Therefore, the spirit of the Imperial Chaplains is still alive with the Imperial Insane Vice Lords organization. This is the story of how Imperial Insane Vice Lords became so strong in the Henry Horner projects and the entire ABLA housing projects, because they were rooted in these buildings, as Imperial Chaplains as far back as the 1943. In the year 1954, an African-American gang formed in the Maxwell Street Market area of the Near West Side, called the Egyptian Cobras. It was said these Cobras broke away from the Imperial Chaplains gang. It is possible these West Side Cobras were founded by one of the Cogwells, or the Cogwell family were involved. it was true that the Cogwells lived on the west side of Chicago during these years. The Egyptian Cobras formed for protection of the black community that resided in around Maxwell and Halstead area. The name Egyptian Cobras was chosen because the black Egyptian cobra snake is the most dangerous snake in the world that has venom that can kill quickly. The Egyptian cobra dominated Africa and is the most common deadly snake in the continent. The Egyptian cobra is also known to appear in other continents around the world, including North America. This snake is also known to be the largest sized venomous snake in Africa. Not only was this name chosen because of the deadly and dominating nature of the reptile itself, but also because in ancient Egyptian culture, the Egyptian cobra snake was an iconic symbol in Egyptian mythology and was the symbol of sovereignty of the pharaohs. Ancient Egypt was the first civilization, and since it is an African country, it shows how Africans were first to walk the earth and the first civilized society in Egypt. It also represents symbolism of their African ancestors and their divinity. This the biggest reason for the Egyptian cobra name. The Egyptian Cobras became a large gang in the North Lawndale community by 1958. At some point, many Cobras migrated out of the near West Side and settled in the K-Town area of North Lawndale, and by 1958, they dominated these streets, contesting with the Clover Street gang. In the year 1958, a group of black youths from the Fuller Park community came together to fight back against racial issues they were dealing with from mostly white Irish gangs from the neighboring Canaryville neighborhood. These youths called themselves Egyptian Cobras, just like the West Side group. Just like the Egyptian Cobras from the West Side, the name was chose for the same reasons. The youths that formed the South Side Cobras were aware of the West Side Cobras group and were likely related to them, and or perhaps the Cogwell family had now moved to the South Side and took on that name from their old neighborhood. To put this in perspective, the South Side Cobra group that had now formed at 43rd and Princeton in Fuller Park had relations and or family from the Egyptian Cobras on the West Side, but this was not the same organization. The Southside Cobras would become a completely different and unlinked organization to the West Side. However, they would have ties that would allow them to hang out together and sometimes engage in gang activity together. But these two groups were not one in the same. This can be difficult to digest because they had the same name and same concepts, and even family ties. But for some reason, both groups chose to be two different entities. This group of Egyptian Cobras started in the year 1958 in the Fuller Park neighborhood at 43rd and Princeton. In the 1950s, the Fuller Park community was transitioning from being a mostly white community into being a mostly black community, and the racial transition was not an easy one, but it was not well documented. Within no time, the Egyptian Cobras spread into the Inglewood, Washington Park, and Grand Boulevard communities. This piece is dedicated to the South Side group of the Egyptian Cobras. The Cobras would become a permanent part of the Fuller Park community, as members have been heavily vested in these streets for generations. These streets have always been the main stronghold of the Cobra. Within no time, the Cobras spread to the Inglewood neighborhood, 45th and State, in the Grand Boulevard neighborhood, and in the Cabrini Green projects in the near North Side neighborhood. In the Inglewood community, there were escalating racial tensions and violence between blacks and whites, as this neighborhood was rapidly changing from a majority white community to a majority black community. This was brought on by the Dan Ryan Expressway construction that pushed families to reside in other communities they were not welcome in. Greaser gangs from Inglewood were enraged over this, and a rather brief but intense racial rivalry happened in Inglewood that was undocumented. Egyptian Cobras arrived to fight white gangs like the Sons of Italy and others. Within a short amount of time, the Cobras developed a rivalry with another black gang that formed in the same year called the Devil's Disciples. By the end of the year, this rivalry was the focus over racial issues, as white flight had already mostly ran its course by the end of the year. In Inglewood, Leonard Johnson, these Cobras, and may have been the co-founder that started that chapter. In December of 1959, Johnson was put in prison, perhaps ending his leadership of this sect. In the Grand Boulevard community, Egyptian Cobras moved into the tenement apartments that were known as the Black Belt. The Cobras lived in these blighted buildings in the late 50s at 45th and State until the buildings were razed in 1960. Even after the buildings were razed, the Cobras still regarded this area heavily. Legend has it that Joe Bob started the Cobras, or at least the 45th and State branch, in the Grand Boulevard neighborhood. This was the start of a permanent part of Cobra history. As decades have passed, the Cobras have remained a larger part of this community. The Cobras quickly migrated to the Cabrini Green public housing projects in the 1150 to 1152 buildings, started by Solomon King Taylor, who ran that section of Cobras and was likely a co-founder. This is how Mickey Cobras ended up in Cabrini Green until the city tore the projects down. Taylor was titled Supreme Chief, so perhaps he ran the entire organization at the startup. The Cobra presence in Cabrini Green was legendary, as they heavily contested the gangster disciples over these buildings. By 2011, after the projects were razed, it closed that chapter of the Mickey Cobras, but the Cobras remained strong in the nearby Marshall Field apartments. The Cobras settled this public housing apartment complex in 1958 when they first formed. The Cobras remain a permanent and large part of these apartments for generations and have much invested in these buildings. Another public housing project the Cobras took a large piece of was the Dearborn Home projects in the Douglas community. I am not sure exactly when the Cobras came here, but I believe they showed in the late 50s, but I am not sure. The Cobras are a permanent group in these buildings, even after renovations in 2007. These Cobras have always been a force fighting against the gangster disciples for decades. Another public housing project the Cobras have a permanent settlement at is the Wentworth Gardens projects, located in the Armour Square neighborhood. This part of the neighborhood is located on the border with Fuller Park. Pershing Road is the divider between the neighborhoods. Cobra presence in these projects has been key for drug trafficking from the Dan Ryan Expressway, as an exit was right by the projects, and this would lead down the Princeton Ave corridor into the heart of Mickey Cobra turf. I do not know when Cobras arrived in these projects, but I speculate they may have arrived in the late 50s, as they have become well ingrained in these buildings. They have battled with the gangster disciples for decades for these buildings. In the year 1959, as black migration spread deeper into the south side, Egyptian Cobras came alongside this further south settlement as they arrived in the Washington Park community. Washington Park had long been a black community for decades, but had fallen into deep poverty and heavy crime. Blighted buildings were common sight in Washington Park, as this neighborhood was one of the tougher communities in the city. The Egyptian Cobras and the Devil's Disciples arrived in 1959 to police these streets and deal with criminal groups that terrorized the community. Within a short amount of time, the groups concentrated more on their rivalry, and many members would then add to the crime issues, as long as it wasn't in their own parts of the neighborhood. The Cobras settled in the 51st to 53rd Street area, preferring the northern part of the community, while Disciples mostly settled south of 53rd Street. The Cobras became especially strong in the 53rd and State area in the tenement buildings until they were razed in 1960. Cobras still regarded this area heavily and would prepare for settlement in the new Robert Taylor projects soon to be constructed. When the projects were raised in 1998 at 53rd and State, the Cobras remained in the Washington Park community, but would remain small in number but highly functional. The 51st to 53rd and Calumet area has become a permanent home for the Cobras, but in a smaller capacity. Cobras settled in the east side of the Woodlawn community in 1959, which was another all-black community struggling with crime and poverty. The Cobras came to East Woodlawn to police these streets, but just like Washington Park, the Cobras of East Woodlawn ended up battling the Devil's Disciples of West Woodlawn. Then by the end of the year, they began battling the newly formed Blackstone Rangers. The Cobras made East Woodlawn their permanent home with a strong presence that has become permanent. Cobras are heavily invested in Woodlawn and have shared these streets close by the Black Pea Stones with on and off violent rivalries, which goes back to 1959. Another heavily invested Cobra neighborhood is the South Shore community. The Egyptian Cobras arrived here in 1959 alongside the Devil's Disciples. Both groups came here to deal with racial issues black families were facing while settling South Shore for the first time. Historically, South Shore was known to have a strong racist element that heavily opposed the expansion of the Black Belt onto these streets. In 1959, values on property in South Shore began to decline, as this became more of a planned community for racial transition. This brought about an undocumented racial clash that brought Disciples and Cobras here to assist black youths being victimized. The Cobras came here to protect and ended up getting involved in violent gang wars with the Disciples. Cobras and Disciples often fell into criminal behavior as well. South Shore has continued to be coveted streets for the Mickey Cobras that have a permanent presence in the northwest part of the neighborhood. In the year 1959, the Cobras settled the tough streets of Greater Grand Crossing. This community was a more freshly racially trans community like Woodlawn. Like Woodlawn, Greater Grand Crossing was now plagued with blight, high crime, disinvestment, and high poverty. The Cobras came to assist the black community, but this chapter was not highly successful and closed in the 1960s. The Cobras once had a large following in the Greater Grand Crossing neighborhood that even famous social workers Fred Strotbeck and James Short discovered in 1959 when they mainly studied female members of the gang called Cobrettes. A December 8, 1959, Chicago Tribune article reported that Cobras had invaded the territory of a Southside gang and they were going to fight at the Dan Ryan Woods. When the fight didn't happen, the Cobras wandered to the north side of the city to the North Center neighborhood, where they played catch with a shotgun at the Riverview Park Festival, scaring the crowd to death. This makes me wonder why a deeper South Side area was chosen as the fighting place. Perhaps this may have been when the Cobras came to Roseland for the first time in 1959. The Egyptian Cobras boosted their numbers not only with further South Side settlement, but also because of an alliance with another South Side gang called the King Cobras. In 1959, both gangs merged their concepts to an extent, creating the Egyptian King Cobras in 1959. The King Cobras were led by Theotis Emperor The Clark. The two Cobra gangs had something in common, besides being both named Cobra. The King Cobra is also known to be one of the longest and most venomous snakes in the world. Another interesting fact is that the characteristics of both types are often combined when used in Indian chakra mythology, the serpent of Kundalini. Both organizations had strong beliefs about the betterment of the black community, and this brought both leaders together to combine concepts. By 1960, according to the Terre Haute Tribune Star newspaper, July 17, 1960, issue, it was reported there were 500 members of the Egyptian Cobras on the south side of Chicago, and hundreds more in two chapters on the west side of the city. The article stated the Cobras were on 3 sides of the city, indicating they had migrated up north. The only likely area up north would be Cabrini Green and Marshall Field. Source: Terre Haute Tribune Star, July 17, 1960. Even though the source talked about the west side, in reality, the west side and south side were not connected and were not the same organization. In the year 1960, all branches of the Egyptian Cobras went on a violent and murderous rampage, living up their name. As I said, the Egyptian cobra snake is deadly, dangerous, and dominating. And that is exactly how the Cobras acted in 1960 and 1961, as their legendary rampage soon engulfed the newspapers with tales of violent crime and murder. Member addresses in the papers showed anywhere from the Maxwell Street Market area to North Lawndale to Inglewood, Hyde Park, Woodlawn, and a lot of them in Grand Boulevard. In 1960, Henry Johnny Ringo Ponder was only 16 years old, but already proving to be a dangerous leader, as he led groups of Cobras on a murderous crime spree in the Hyde Park area between 1960 and 1962. The spree started on November 23, 1960, when Ponder, James Braden, and Jonathan Phillips robbed a tailor shop at 53rd and Woodlawn, beating the 72-year-old shop owner, Lester Wolfe, to death. In March of 1961, the 3 were said to have robbed and killed a cab driver at 51st and Cottage Grove. When Ponder was arrested in February of 1962, he was already on trial for the murder of Lucius O'Neill, a security guard at a laundromat at 51st and Cottage Grove on August 19, 1961. 4 other members of the Cobras were also apprehended for shooting a man at 54th and University that refused to give up his money when he was robbed. After Ponder was convicted of his crimes in 1962, 17-year-old Henry Mickey Cogwell stepped up to lead the Southside Cobras. Mickey was a fast-talking hustler, overflowing with charisma, and was heavily involved in the policy racket that was controlled by the Italian mafia. This early relation tapped the Cobras in with organized crime. Mickey was related to possible founder James Cogwell, but Mickey was not the founder, but could have been a co-founder, as he was 13 when the Egyptian Cobras started in the South Side. Henry Cogwell shifted the Cobras to the freshly built Robert Taylor public housing projects that was built directly over the old territory at 45th and State. Now Cobras moved back into 45th and State and took the 4555 and 4525 buildings. Cobras also took the 41-1 building near 40th Place and Federal. The Cobras near 51st and Wabash in Washington Park immediately moved into the 5326, 53322 and 53323 buildings that formed a U-shape that became known as the Hole. Mickey Cogwell had moved into these buildings with his family in 1962. Therefore, he directly was in supervision of the Hole. In 1962, when the Cobras squashed their wars with Blackstone Rangers, after Henry Cogwell proposed an alliance idea to Theotis Clark. Clark at first rejected the idea, but then reluctantly accepted, and this is how Stones and Cobras first came together. The Cobras now became known as the Cobra Stones, which was a name not seen in the news until the late 60s. This is also how the Egyptian Cobra name vanished from the news as well, unless they were reporting on the Egyptian Cobras on the west side. The Cabrini Green and Marshall Field Cobras all became Cobra Stones as well. The west side Cobras would have nothing to do with Blackstone Rangers or any Cobra Stone name. This further shows how separate these Cobra groups were. After the conviction of Henry Ponder, the Cobras went into seclusion, more or less, and were not in the paper as much between 1963 and 1968. By the later 1960s, the Cobras were able to take over more of the Robert Taylor homes while still being led by Joe Bob. The Cobras now opened at the 4844 building at 48th and State that extended down to 49th and State. These Cobras became known as the Fidel Castro Cobras. Mickey Cogwell was appointed the official spokesman for the Black P. Stone Alliance in 1968. Cogwell's brother Jerome Pony Soldier Cogwell was killed on September 7th or 8th, 1968, at 5244 State Street, right outside the entrance of the Robert Taylor homes. The murders were done by the Devil's Disciples, which was the main gang allied with the Disciple Alliance. In December of 1968, Jeff Fort led a massive march down State Street, demanding that the city rename State Street after Jerome Cogwell. The Stones proceeded to smash windows, cars and rioting all up and down as they marched, causing destruction. This march was meant to protest the disorderly conduct charge that police were using to harass residents. The Cobra Stones were closely regarded, but the Black P Stones, and this showed during this demonstration. In January of 1969, despite the investigations on the Stones and Jeff Fort, and Jeff out on the Senate hearing in July of 1968, a major shock came to law enforcement when an Illinois politician sent an invitation to Jeff Fort to appear at the January 1969 Nixon presidential inauguration ball. Jeff Fort declined the invitation and instead sent Mickey Cogwell, the Cobra Stone leader, to the ball, alongside Herman Moose Holmes, another Maine 21 leader. While Mickey Cogwell was mingling with high society politicians, making the Stones look great. Chicago police were back home trying to arrest him for crimes, and even went to his house just to find out he wasn't there. And worst yet, when they found out he was invited to the White House, they had a major fit. Law enforcement all over the Chicago area felt betrayed that Stone leaders were invited to this event, further solidifying Mickey Cogwell's political connections, which of course would help connections to the whole Black P Stone Nation. Funding had mostly dried up by 1969 for the Black P Stones due to the senatorial investigations. Mickey Cogwell and Ryko Cranshaw were the first Stones to bring the nation into the direct drug trade business. Chicago Police Department's GIU group claims to have photos and surveillance of Stones and Italian mafia associates meeting to discuss this business. The first of these meetings was with Joseph Little Caesar DeVarco, Joseph Big Joe Arnold, and Morris Lasky. This was supposedly when the Stones began to directly partake in the drug trade, mainly in heroin and prescription teas and blues. The motivation for this connection was because Stones needed the money, as their numbers had exceeded 6,000 members by 1969, and the legitimate forms of money they were receiving prior were either non-existent or minimal. The Stones were the first gang to engage in higher-level drug marketing, and this is how Jeff Fort got the reputation as being the king of the heroin business on the South Side, even though he was not involved in this early deal. This started out a deal for just Cranshaw's Stones and Cogwell's Cobra Stones, the almighty Black P Stone Nation, Moore, Williams. Because of this business deal with Cogwell, this is how the first major heroin distribution business came to the Robert Taylor projects, especially in the whole cluster of 3 buildings around 53rd and State in the Washington Park neighborhood. This heroin involvement was not big enough to catch the attention of law enforcement, as much as mainly Stones were known for selling marijuana, codeine, and other narcotics and pills. Stones also began robbing other drug dealers in the area, as they went to great lengths by even robbing drug dealer homes. Beginning in the year 1970, the Cobras in Cabrini Green began to take their war with the Black Deuces to another level, as the guns were blazing in these projects for the next 2 years, causing many deaths, including 2 Chicago police officers that were picked off by sniper fire in 1970. A member of the Cobra Stones was the shooter, and when leadership of the Cobra Stones found out, they demanded this member turn himself over to the police. In 1972, Jeff Fort was brought up on several charges for mismanaging government funding, and he was sentenced to 4 years in prison. Before he left, he appointed Mickey Cogwell to be the interim leader and to keep Eugene Hairston out of power if he got paroled. Cogwell at that point was running the entire BPSN on the streets, and became well known along with the Cobra stone name. Although Cogwell was heavily tapped into the numbers racket, he was still more known as an activist that involved himself in the political side of helping the black community. And this caused the press to have less interest in him because he didn't fit the full mold as the gangster kingpin the public wanted. In March of 1976, Jeff Fort was released from Leavenworth Federal Prison. He made a big announcement that he had converted to the Nation of Islam while he was in Leavenworth. Now he expected select members of the BPSN to convert to the Nation of Islam and become the El Rukns. Jeff Fort asked Mickey Cogwell to join the El Rukns, but Mickey declined. But there were no hard feelings like many believe. Rumors had flown around that Jeff Fort ordered the death of Mickey Cogwell on February 25, 1977. On this day, Mickey was walking home at 3:45 in the morning to his Auburn Gresham home after he had been dropped off. An assassin came up behind him and Mickey started to run. The assassin fired his 9 into the back of Cogwell. After Cogwell collapsed, shot him 2 more times in the back, then fled. No one was prosecuted or identified as the killer. Many thought Jeff Fort ordered the hit. It was said Mickey was killed because he spoke out about the new Islamic doctrines, but that was never verified. The Cobras then changed the organization's name to the Mickey Cobras and wanted to separate from the Black P Stones, once again becoming an individual organization. Mickey was likely gunned down by the Chicago outfit, especially since his partner, who was a white Chicago outfit member, was killed at the same time. Henry Mickey Cogwell was greatly missed by the Cobra Nation, as he was a clever hustler and big-time numbers racket chief. For the first time since Teddy Rowe, a black man was back in charge of the numbers racket since the outfit took it over after Rowe's death in 1952. Mickey ran the racket like a mob boss while still helping the community and being active in politics. It was Mickey that repaired the Cobra organization that originally taught the black man to stand up to white gangs in the 1950s. Mickey rebuilt the nation when he took over. However, Mickey's legacy still remained with the Cobra's leadership. In April 1978, the Mickey Cobras joined the People Nation Alliance with E.L. Rukns, Black P Stones, and Vice Lords. Many have thought the Cobras broke away from the Stones, bitter because of Islam being pushed on the Stone Nation, but that isn't correct. After the killing of Henry Cogwell, relations between Cobras and El Rukns were not good, even after being bound by the People Alliance. Cobras still used the name King Cobras, which is the part of the organization led by Theotis Clark and Herman Moose Jackson. In 1985, Jeff Fort ordered the murders of several King Cobras in April of 1985. According to court documents in the case of United States versus Andrews, Jeff Fort wanted complete control of the heroin trade at 54th and Bishop in the back of the yard neighborhoods and 67th and Stony Island in the Woodlawn neighborhood. The King Cobras stood in the way of Jeff Fort's progress, and the indictment stated that Fort summoned the guerrilla family hit squad of the El Rukns to kill off the leadership of the King Cobras. This resulted in the death of Herman Moose Jackson and the attempted assassination of Theotis Clark, Andre Chalmers, and Tredis Murray. Rico Chalmers, Glendon McKinley, and Vicky Noldenand were all killed by the El Rukns in this conspiracy. Murray was in charge of the Cobras at this point in time. The main purpose of this war was argument over drug turf in the Woodlawn community. The original agreement was that for the Cobras to run the drug trafficking at 67th and Blackstone during the daytime, while the El Rukns would run it by night. This only lasted a month before a disagreement happened, and the El Rukns assassinated Cobra Stone and planned to shoot others that included Theotis Clark. Rico Chalmers, Glendon McKinley, and Vicky Nolden were Cobras killed by the El Rukns at 54th and Bishop in the back of the yards, which was Cobra territory at the time. As the 1980s progressed, the Mickey Cobras grew in numbers, spreading in many more areas on the south side and into some suburbs by the 1990s and 2000s. I think the King Cobra name diminished after the assassinations and attempted assassinations in 1985, as they all seemed to go by Mickey Cobras going forward. Mickey Cobras also grew very large in the 1980s because of the sanctions passed down to the Black Pea Stones by the El Rukns. In the year 1979, the El Rukns declared that all stones had to drop the name Black Pea Stone or Blackstone or face dire consequences. Many stones then flipped to Mickey Cobras to avoid these sanctions, and MCs became very close to the Maniac Pea Stones. This is how the MCs bounced back after leaving the BPS. In the 1990s, thousands, much of Cobra territory was removed due to the demolition of the Cabrini Green and Robert Taylor public housing projects, which were the two biggest sections the Cobras had. 53rd and State. The whole was a big-time piece of turf that brought in many thousands of dollars from the drug trade in these buildings. When they tore the whole down in 1998, Cobras were forced to move further norther above 51st Street, living among black disciples and gangster disciples, resulting in a bloody war until those buildings were removed by 2006. Mickey Cobras still retain a strong presence in Fuller Park, Washington Park, South Shore, Woodlawn, Grand Boulevard, Armour Square, Wentworth Gardens, near North Side, Marshall Fields Apartments, and Roseland Community. Mickey Cobras are more of a secretive organization that rarely appears in media outlets. Cobras prefer operating this way because it keeps them further below the radar.
If you haven't already, please take a second to subscribe to the channel, and also don't forget to click on the notification bell so you'll be up to date on all videos released from the Everything Network.